Welcome. My name is Joel Berkowitz. I'm director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies and professor of English here at UWM. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all in person and online this evening to the 2026 Faye Sigmund Woman of Valor Lecture. This year, we are very glad to host our colleague Jenny Caplan from the University of Cincinnati for her talk, Funny You Don't Look Funny, Jews, Comedy, and Gender. I just have some words of thanks to start with and a few logistical things, and then I will turn the floor over to our speaker. So first of all, a huge thanks, as always, to the Taxman and Temkin families whose generosity makes this series possible. Over the course of several decades, the Faye Sigmund Woman of Valor Lecture has showcased many of the most exciting projects at the intersection of Jewish studies and women's studies and brought a distinguished array of scholars to UWM, including Deborah Dash Moore, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, Hasia Diner, Robin Judd, Jody Eichler-Levine, last year's speaker, and many, many others. We are honored to add Jenny Caplan to that list with this year's lecture. We also thank our co-sponsors, the Departments of English and Women's and Gender Studies. Thanks also to our hosts, the UWM Libraries, to Jay Piney and Josh Yang from Classroom Services for their wonderful support, to Stahl Center Deputy Director Rachel Baum, without whom none of this would happen or certainly not go smoothly, to Susan Wagner for staff support, and also to Christine Greco. A couple of logistical things. There will be Q&A after the talk, both for in-person and online participants. If you are online on the Zoom, then feel free to drop questions in the Q&A at any time, and Rachel Baum will be moderating that and delivering those over to us during the Q&A. There are delicious refreshments for anyone here in person, so do help yourself. And in the in-person audience, we have our feedback cards. Please do fill those out. We would love to hear what you think. And also, if you're not already on our mailing list, we would love to add you. There will also be a survey sent to the Zoom participants afterwards. And either way, if we get feedback from you, you will be eligible for a drawing for one of Professor Caplan's books, either Funny You Don't Look Funny or her new edited collection, co-edited collection, Wit Happens, which is brand new, basically, more or less hot off the press. Just want to say a little bit more about Faye Sigmund, who we have always been delighted to honor with this talk, to honor her memory. This was a talk that, as I said, was set up many years ago in honor of Myra Taxman and Lee Temkin's mother, Faye Greenberg Sigmund. I never had the pleasure of getting to know Faye Sigmund. She passed before I arrived here, but I have heard many wonderful stories about her over the years. She was clearly very committed to the Jewish community in Appleton, Wisconsin, where she lived. She was indeed a woman of valor, a woman of culture and learning and community. And we are very, very honored to always be honoring her memory with this wonderful event. It's something that we're very proud of. And we remember also the memories of Bud and Lee Temkin and Royal Taxman, all of whom are greatly missed. And a big hello to Myra Taxman and to all of the Taxman and Temkin family members who are here, either with us in the room or online. And with that, I would like to just say a few words to introduce our speaker. Jenny Caplan is a scholar of American religion and popular culture and a professor at the University of Cincinnati, where she is the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati Chair in Judaic Studies. Professor Caplan specializes in American Judaism and works extensively with film, television, internet media, humor, graphic novels, video games, board games, and other sites of popular culture engagement. Her book, Funny You Don't Look Funny, Judaism and Humor from the Silent Generation to Millennials, was published in 2023, and the collection she co-edited, Wit Happens, Global Jewish Humor, was published in 2026. She is currently working on Unmasked, Jewish Characters in DC and Marvel. Some of us who attended her workshop this afternoon got a really interesting taste of that, for which we're very grateful. And now I would like to welcome Jenny Caplan up and talk about Funny You Don't Look Funny. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so pleased to be here with you. I am pleased to be giving this talk that is, named for a woman who I have come to know was pretty extraordinary, just in my brief time here, and so I'm just very happy to be here this evening. So I kind of think about this talk as partly an investigation of American Jewish humor, but it ends up being a little bit more an act of autoethnography, which is a genre that I kind of think of as being very well suited to feminist endeavors, as well as being I hope, less than mind-numbingly boring looking at demographic data, which is, weirdly enough, a thing that's very near and dear to my heart. And when you come to a lecture about Jewish comedy, I know what you expect is going to be a lot of demographic data. So throw it together, and I promise it won't hurt as much as you think it might. But one of the questions that I get when I'm asked why I've published now 2 books on Jewish comedy is how I came to that topic, why I came to that topic, why I find Jewish humor important. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight. And I'm going to do it in a little bit of a roundabout fashion. And I have also, in particular, I'm very excited tonight with you to have added in a more explicitly gender studies piece to it, which I think is an important part of the story and which doesn't always get included in discussions of some of the data. So as Joel mentioned, in 2023, I published my monograph, Funny You Don't Look Funny, which is a look at 4 generations of American Jewish comedians, starting with the silent generation and moving up to millennials. And it specifically looks at engagement with humor that is focused on elements of religious Judaism, so Jewish rituals, Jewish texts, rabbis, things like that. And then Wit Happens came together out of a conference that I organized that actually happened from February 28th to March 2nd, 2020. So it was the shut down. And we had some speakers at that conference that we were not sure were actually going to be able to get back to Israel because Israel had already started shutting its borders. But we started to question why so much of the narrative about Jewish humor always looked at just the United States and this kind of Ashkenormative, very Ashkenazi bubble. We started to call it and say, but there are Jews everywhere. Does their humor look the same? And so that became the new volume that is just a month old as of yesterday. So it's still a little baby book, but it includes American and Israeli examples as well, but we have chapters about North Africa, we have chapters about Japan, we have chapters about India, so looking at Jewish comedy around the world. And so, having put out these now 2 books, people ask me, why Jewish humor? Why do you think that that's such an important place to look for this story about American Jewish comedy or American Jewish history? So I sort of like to start back in 1964, as anyone would. So I situate the beginning of my story, the way that I want to tell it, with this 1964 issue of Look magazine. And on the cover of that, up in the corner here, we have this little story that's somehow the formatting got slightly off in downloading my PowerPoint tonight, so the circle is not where it normally is. But the story up there is called The Vanishing American Jew. And this article was one of the first to appear in print and to kind of put language to something that American Jews had been worrying about and talking about amongst themselves, which was this idea that they had a sense that intermarriage was on the rise, and they had a sense that that was having some kind of impact on affiliations with synagogues and memberships at JCCs and kind of an engagement with organized Jewish life. But nobody had really put words to it yet, and they certainly didn't have data for it yet. So this article comes out in Look, and as tends to happen, a lot of this talk tonight is going to be follow the money. So this panicked a lot of people. It panicked a lot of people with money. And so they did what they tend to do, which is throw money at the problem. And so they hired some demographers and some folks to do the first major demographic study of American Jews to figure out exactly what they were looking at in terms of patterns and trends and where Jews were living and what they were doing and how all of that looked. And so what that became was the 1970 National Jewish Population Study, which got published in 1971. You can't read most of this, that's fine. It's really dull. But it had a few important things that I want to highlight. And again, this is the first time that American Jews are being presented with this kind of data-driven look at what was happening in the American Jewish community and kind of across the country. And so it told us a few things. First of all, it estimated up here that there are about 5.4 million Jews in the United States in 1970. They said 5.37 million. And so those 5.37 million persons were in Jewish households. And when Jewish residents of institutions are added, the number would be increased by up to 50,000. So that puts us up over 5.4 million. And they said when we pull in everybody together, we get to about 5.8 million Jews in the United States. So that's what they're estimating the population was at this point. And they started to try to figure out some of the ineffable questions about Jewish identity. And one of the reasons they're ineffable is because they're really hard to quantify. So a lot of the data in this original 1970 National Jewish Population Study is very bad. But it was the first. It was trying. So they asked questions like, being Jewish means something very definite to me. Sure. Everybody agreed that it means something very definite. Is that good? I don't know. They don't know. They didn't ask that. But only maybe 7% of people were like, no, being Jewish, I don't even know what that means. Second question, I feel Jewish, but I can't explain how or why. Once again, we got a decent number of people who said yes, but that's actually about 50-50 on that one. You have about 50% who disagreed and about 50% who agreed or were undecided. So this is sort of what they're wrestling with in this first question, in this first study. But I will also point out a couple of things that were buried in the summary, which start asking questions about intermarriage. Because remember, this is actually what's driving a lot of this, is mid-20th century panic about the rising Jewish intermarriage rate. So we have some stuff buried over here that says of all Jewish persons now married, some 9.2% are intermarried. That is not terribly high. 9.2% is not bad. But when they start to break that down by people who were married in the 40s, people who got married in the 50s, they're going to come to see some different stuff. But what I want to particularly point out for tonight to start this conversation is that they mention specifically things like the combination of a Jewish husband and a non-Jewish wife is about twice as prevalent as the combination of a Jewish wife and a non-Jewish husband. So 2 times as many Jewish men were marrying non-Jewish women as Jewish women were marrying non-Jewish men. You would think that that would lead to an interpretation that this was a problem, if you see it as a problem, that really needs to be presented in terms of what the men are doing. You would be wrong about that. This is going to become data that is presented in such a way that the question becomes, what is wrong with you, Jewish women, that you are not attracting Jewish men in sufficient quantities? Because clearly that is the logical interpretation of this data. And then it goes into some questions about conversion. So about 1/4 of all intermarrying non-Jewish women, it says females. I'm going to change that to women because females is just gross. So 1/4 of all intermarrying non-Jewish women report conversion into Judaism. In contrast, few intermarrying non-Jewish men have converted. So again, we have data on the number of women who are doing things, and we're just going to say few men. We're not even going to bother counting them. It's just few. In a very large majority of cases, when the wife is Jewish, though initially the husband is not Jewish, children are raised as Jewish. Again, this seems yay for the ladies. On the other hand, when the husband is Jewish and the wife initially not Jewish, about 1/3 of the children are raised outside of the Jewish religion. So this last point, I think, is really important for our conversation tonight and for a general understanding of how this was interpreted. This, once again, is one of those points that seems as though it's actually saying that Jewish women are strong proponents of raising their children Jewishly, and Jewish women are intermarrying at half the rate of Jewish men. So this should all be very positive for the presentation towards Jewish women. It does not work that way, and we can have some conversation during the Q&A if we want to. There are some specific people, men, who were behind a lot of this data collection, who in a, let's call it a post-Me Too era, we have learned things about that makes it less surprising that they interpreted the data the way that they did. But this starts us out in 1971. And this begins to scare people a little bit. And also kind of buried in the data were a little more breakdown about this gender disparity in intermarriage. So in the vast majority of cases, the husband was Jewish, the wife non-Jewish by birth. Only 0.1% represented a Jewish wife whose husband was born not Jewish. So the intermarriages that they're counting are vastly disproportionately Jewish men marrying non-Jewish women, which again, if we want to talk about it in the Q&A, we can talk about my opinion about how the media continues to reenact that and how we have hundreds of Jewish movies and TV shows that are all built on that same model. And then I also want to pull out this table over here. Jewish fertility ratio, number of children under 5 to number of women aged 20 to 44 in selected communities, everywhere from New Orleans to Columbus, Ohio. Nowhere in Wisconsin. I apologize. Apparently you didn't exist. And so they are looking at the fertility rate of Jewish women. And this becomes one of the things that gets pointed to as a problem, that Jewish women don't want to have as high a number of children as non-Jewish women do. And that this is one of the things that is driving these Jewish men to select non-Jewish spouses, is that Jewish women are withholding, Jewish women are frigid. This all becomes the backbone of the 1970s, 1980s Jap stereotype. So there is a lot that comes out of this data that's not great. This then gets redone in 1990, at which point they invented color and data visualization. So that's great. So when the 1990 National Jewish Population Study came out, everybody lost their mind, because the 1990 NJPS is the one that first publicized the idea that more than 50% of Jews were now intermarrying. And as soon as that number became public, people lost their mind. In hindsight, the data collection on this 1990 NJPS was very poor, and we have mostly discarded a lot of their findings, including the finding of a more than 50% intermarriage rate. It looks now as though it was not and has not ever been quite that high. It is in the 40s, it is high, but the data does not actually seem to bear this out. But follow the money. As soon as they published that more than 50% of American Jews were now marrying non-Jews, that caused another huge influx of money that was interested in fixing the problem. And again, you'll never guess who gets blamed for the problem. I bet you can. So this time around, they started asking some more targeted questions. And so they asked things like, hypothetically, if your child were considering marrying a non-Jewish person, would you strongly support, accept, be neutral, oppose, or strongly oppose the marriage? And you will be pleased to learn that very few people strongly opposed. And they have this broken down into Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, Jews who identify as other, they have it kind of broken down into their level of Jewish identity. But even of the most Jewishly identified, only 9% said that they would strongly oppose. So that's good. People are not mostly pulling a tevya and kicking Chava out of the family for, daring to marry Fiedka. And then they also ask things like, do you agree or disagree that anti-Semitism is a serious problem in the US today? And it was, as you would expect, most people said they strongly agree or somewhat agree. Very few people disagreed that anti-Semitism was an issue. So it's sort of trying to approach the same questions that 1970 was asking, but it's trying to do it in a slightly different way. There we go. And so out of the 1990 study, I pulled a couple of quotations for you as well, to show the evolution of this question about gender and about what is happening with Jewish men and Jewish women. So here they say that the data suggests that intermarriages resulting in conversion of the non-Jewish spouse more often involve a Jewish-born man whose wife chose Judaism than a Jewish-born woman whose husband made such a choice. Women may also be more likely to choose Judaism for reasons unrelated to marriage. So once again, the problem is Jewish women because their non-Jewish husbands are not converting, whereas Jewish husbands are doing a fine job of getting their non-Jewish spouse to convert. Additionally here, we're told the data suggests that to the extent that changes in the identity composition of the Jewish population are associated with changing marital stability, any trend toward higher levels of secularism and intermarriage by Jewish women are likely to be associated with higher levels of marital instability. Intermarriage by Jewish women only are associated with higher levels of marital instability. And then finally, we're told that the approach of looking for distinctive Jewish names, which was one of the ways that they tried to collect data at one point, like let's just go through the phone book and call people who seem like they have a Jewy last name. It turns out that's not a great way to collect data. And so one of the problems is that this approach loses its usefulness as the rate of intermarriage rises, especially as more Jewish women intermarry and take the non-Jewish names of their husbands, even if their husbands converted to Judaism. So women are ruining everything all the time, even when their spouse has converted. Okay, fast forward to 2000 then. They realized there were a lot of problems with the 1990 study. They do it again in 2000. And this time they try to fix some of the stuff. And you can see that now we have adjusted the intermarriage rate down. So even those who have most recently gotten married are only at a 47% intermarriage rate here. So one of the things that they did adjust for is to try to get a better handle on that. And they said, all right, it wasn't 50%, it isn't 50%, but it is high. 47% is still high. And here is where we start to get to some of the important things for my part of the story and where I kind of come into the story. And this is the kind of first one of these studies that would have included me in theory as a young adult. 2000, was I? Yes, barely. So here we're asking now some questions about things that Jewish children are doing. And so here, this table says multiple classification analysis, the impact of informal Jewish education on Jewish identity indicators, controlling for Jewish background. So did you attend a Jewish youth group? Did you participate in Jewish camping? Did you travel to Israel as a young person? And then they're comparing that to whether people married a Jewish spouse or married a non-Jewish spouse, and then looking at things like how they rated their level of ritual observance. Did they belong to a synagogue? Did they say being Jewish was very important? Did they say that they were very attached to Israel? And so it is not for nothing that this comes out in 2000, and follow the money, the birthright program gets funded shortly thereafter. Because this is one of the things they looked at and said, well, gosh, the absolute highest answer was, did you travel to Israel? Are you in married? 71%. That's the only one that broke 70. So clearly getting young people to Israel is the answer. Sexual Zionism is the answer. Let's put them on a plane and tell them we'll pay for their honeymoon if they get married after birthright. Which is an urban legend. They don't actually do that. But this is why that becomes a focus in the early 2000s, is because this data showed that Israel travel was hugely important, as was Jewish camping, as was Jewish youth group. They were all important, but that Israel was really the most important indicator of how attached somebody was going to be to a Jewish identity. Again, pulling out some of the things where they broke stuff out by gender. So for all age groups up through 44, Jewish women have given birth to fewer children than US women. The gap among 40 to 44-year-olds is small. I don't, you know, it writes itself. Proportionally more Jewish women than all US women remain childless in every age group through 44. And finally, in younger and older age groups, Jewish men are more likely to be intermarried than Jewish women. So that has remained consistent, and yet somehow the problem is still Jewish women who somehow are not US women. But only the ones under the age of 44, because those of us who have passed 44 are now dusty and assumed to be postmenopausal, so we no longer matter. Huzzah. Go team. So let me back that up a second. So this is where things sat at the beginning of the 21st century. And lots of people were rushing to fill this gap in a lot of different ways. As I mentioned, the kind of biggest intervention into this was the birthright program, but we also saw around the same time, we saw a push towards getting more kids involved in Jewish summer camping, that there were a lot of different angles from which people were trying to make interventions into these data. Part of the reason why it matters that this was happening right around 2000 is because that was dealing with a generational cohort, which would be made up of, as I talk about it in my first book, your young Gen X, elder millennials. So these are kids who were born late 1970s, early 1980s. And so these are the children who grew up under the shadow of what the media came to call cultural Judaism. And this idea that cultural Judaism was flawed in some way, that there was proper Judaism, there was religious Judaism, and that was good, and that cultural Judaism was bad. And that was part of the problem, and that was why Jews were That's why the intermarriage rate was high. That's why Jews were not joining synagogues anymore, that cultural Judaism is this issue. And cultural Judaism was always poorly defined. Bagels almost always figured into the explanation, like, oh, do you like bagels? You are a cultural Jew. He likes bagels. Bagels. You watch Seinfeld? You're a cultural Jew. So a lot of it becomes about how you're engaging with popular culture. And if you enjoy Seinfeld, but are not a member of a synagogue, then you are doing something Jewishly wrong. And so the kids who were coming of age around 2000 and in the early 21st century, they are the kids who had spent their entire lives being told that if they saw themselves in those depictions, that they were the problem and that there was something wrong and flawed about them. So then the Pew Foundation entered the chat. And so in 2012 into 2013, the Pew Foundation did this massive study called A Portrait of Jewish Americans. And if you're unfamiliar with the Pew Foundation, they are a nonprofit data gathering firm. They do surveys. Somebody at Pew has an idea of a thing that they might like to investigate, and they send out surveys. So religion is one of the things that Pew traditionally has been interested in, but you can find surveys on absolutely anything. Any data your little data-driven heart would desire. And this is where we get into the autoethnography part, because my little data-driven heart loves to just scroll Pew. But they came out with this in 2013, and it was a bit of a phenomenon, because this is the first time that an organization was gathering this kind of data on American Jews without having any stake in the conversation. 1970, 1990, 2000, those national Jewish population studies were being done by people who had skin in the game, so to speak. They were people who cared about whether synagogues are losing members and how Jewish communities are affiliating or not affiliating. The Pew Foundation, they didn't care. They thought it was interesting to collect the data, but it didn't matter to them on an existential level. So they approached their data collection differently. They asked different kinds of questions, and they got some very interesting, I think, results. And 2013 also happens to be the point at which a brilliant young up-and-coming PhD student needed to propose a topic for her dissertation. So she was sitting there one cold and snowy day at Syracuse University, and she was thinking to herself, what shall I do? What shall become of me? And this comes out. And this gave her an awful lot of ideas. So first off, I want to praise the Pew Foundation for being the first one to recognize that Jewish men are also involved in the process of having children. Thank you. So the fertility chart over here says Jewish adults report having an average of 1.9 children compared with an average of 2.2 children per adult in the same age cohort of the general public. And then they're going to break it down to, again, Jews of religion, Jews of no religion, average number of born Orthodox Jews, Reform Jews. But at no point in here do they make it the problem of Jewish women that they're not having enough children. This is just Jews. Jews are having this number of kids. And you see what you would expect. I mean, so the Orthodox have an average of 4.1 children, so that's almost twice what the national average is. And it drops down, conservative having about 1.8, Reform 1.7, no denomination 1.4. If your spouse is Jewish, you're having 2.8 kids. If your spouse is not Jewish, you're having 1.8 kids. Again, I will remind us that most of those people with a non-Jewish spouse are men. So why are we still blaming women for this? I get a little mad about it. I've spent the last 2 weeks very angry while I was putting this slideshow together. And my friends kind of kept saying, you've really got to stop looking at the data because it's making you so cranky. I was like, I know, but I need to tell people about this. So this is a huge improvement. that the Pew Foundation, again, the one who doesn't care, this is a non-Jewish organization. They are not interested in telling a particular story about Jews. They're just interested in looking at the data. And so they look at the data for all Jews. Yay. But they did a second version in 2020, Jewish Americans in 2020. Again, it was data that was mostly collected in 2019. And they published it in 2020. But there were a couple of important things that started in the 2013 Pew survey and then continued in the 2020. And so I want to just put a couple of those side by side. First of all, they started out in 2013. They were still kind of trying to break things down by generation. So how affiliated with a Jewish identity were you if you were born into the greatest generation, silent generation, baby boom, Gen X, millennial? In 2020, they kind of realized that actually wasn't going to work, in part because we had lost so many members of those top two generations that the data was becoming kind of statistically insignificant. So they just have a total 65 and up, which by this point would actually be most of these top three categories are all compressed into just the 65 and up. But they show a very different picture than the doom and gloom that we were getting with even the 2000 National Jewish Population Study. So they're still saying that even among the youngest, 60% are still identifying as religiously Jewish, 40% are identifying as Jewish, but saying they do not have a religious background. And that's kind of the way that Pew collected the data. They contacted people, they said, are you Jewish? Some of them hung up because when some random person calls you and starts the conversation by saying, are you Jewish? You naturally hang up the phone. But if somebody said, well, yeah, I was born Jewish, but now I'm Methodist or I'm Catholic or whatever, they excluded them. If they identified with a different religion, if they had left Judaism for something else, they're not part of this data. But if they said, I am Jewish and I don't have another religion beyond Judaism, they either became a Jew who said, yes, I'm Jewish and my religion is Judaism, or they became a Jew who said, yes, I'm Jewish, but I don't have a religion. I'm just Jewish. And so they started to break it down, and they showed that even though in 1970 and 1990, we were told that intermarriage meant that within 2 generations, there would be no more American Jews, because if 50% of Jews are intermarrying, and if only 1/3 of those kids of intermarriage are being raised Jewish, then within 2 generations, we're going to run out of Jews. It's very clearly not being borne out by the data that Pew had collected. So this is positive. This is overall good. And this really kind of frustrated some of the earlier Jewish demographers who had stood by their assertion that intermarriage was going to destroy Judaism, American Judaism. But there were some really interesting questions that they started to ask about culture and religion and identity. So in 2013, they asked the question, do you think being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry/culture, religion, or a combination of all three? And all of the people they interviewed, even the ones who say, I am Jewish, my religion is Judaism, even only 17% of those Jews said Judaism is primarily a matter of religion. Most people felt like Judaism was largely either an issue of ancestry and culture or a combination of all three. That the religion was part of the piece, but not the only piece. So this also belied this argument that cultural Judaism was wrong and was bad and was hurting Judaism. Even those Jews who are identifying religiously as Jewish are saying that the bulk of what Judaism is a matter of ancestry and culture. It's being born into a Jewish family. It's being part of the Jewish culture. It's only a little bit about religion, as far as they were saying. They asked the same question in 2020. As you can see, they broke it down a lot more. We got more info about branches, but even amongst Orthodox Jews, only 40% said that it was religion, that it was really just religion that was what Jewish identity was. So you still had a majority, even amongst the Orthodox, who thought that it was at the very least religion and culture together. And they broke it down by age, and they broke it down by whether your spouse is Jewish or your spouse is not Jewish. They broke it down by education level. They broke it out a lot of different ways, but both times, in 2013 and in 2020, it really told the story that Jews in America had come by this point a quarter of the way into the 21st century to feel as though Judaism and Jewish identity was largely driven by culture, and that was no longer being seen as a negative. They also asked some really interesting questions, and this is where 2013 me, when I was working to come up with a dissertation topic, this was my real aha moment. So they asked, what does it mean to be Jewish? And so these are the percent that said blank is an essential part of what being Jewish means to me. The top answer was remembering the Holocaust, 73%. But right here in the middle, we have having a good sense of humor. 42% of American Jews said having a good sense of humor is an essential part of what it means to be Jewish. Statistically, like the exact same number who said caring about Israel. 43% versus 42% is kind of an inconsequential difference. And almost 3 times as many who said eating traditional Jewish foods. So having a good sense of humor has now, by 2013, become a core constituent part of what it means to be Jewish to close to half of American Jews. They asked the question again in 2020. The numbers had actually changed a little bit. So Israel had picked up a few points by 2020. Having a good sense of humor had lost a few points, but it's still more than twice as many as answered observing Jewish law. And 1.5 times as many as eating traditional Jewish foods. So having a good sense of humor remained a core identification point for American Jews. So this is what I looked at in 2013 when I was trying to decide what to write my dissertation on. And I said, this actually matters. If you put together a generation of Jews, well, by this point, 2 generations of Jews who grew up being told that watching Seinfeld makes that if they think of that as a Jewish act, that makes them a bad Jew. And interestingly, Jews use that language well more than other religious groups do. This is data that a woman named Jennifer Thompson out in California has been doing, where she's done data into Google search terms, basically. And the term bad Jew comes up way more than anything else. People will describe themselves as a lapsed Catholic. People will describe themselves as ex-evangelical. People will describe themselves as a recovering Methodist. But Jews will use the term bad to talk about themselves, especially around bacon. It's bacon. You will, like, if you look through social media posts, it'll be, somebody with a picture of a BLT and the caption is, "I'm a bad Jew." So Jews use that good, bad valence to talk about themselves, which other religious groups don't. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's because we have multiple generations now of young Jews who grew up being told that their version of being Jewish was bad because they don't keep kosher, they don't eat traditional Jewish foods. And what they do like to do is things like engagement with comedy. So I saw that as hugely important. And I also saw that as a real indicator that the problem, if there is a problem in American Judaism, is not that younger American Jews are disaffiliating. It's that we're not asking the right questions. That Jews are doing things as Jews. They are still identifying as Jews. And they are doing cultural things and feeling Jewish about them. That they are engaging with comedy, for example, as a Jewish person. And they are seeing that as part of their cultural patrimony. And that to them is a Jewish act. And if they are still engaging with the world in that way, then I don't think it's right to think of them as lost just because they haven't joined a synagogue. And the data still shows that when these young people have children, they do then reaffiliate in larger numbers because they want the kids to go to Sunday school and they want the kids to have a B'nai Mitzvah. So like those trends haven't changed. Young people always disaffiliated. They always came back in larger numbers once they had children. The difference is that spike is getting lower. There is a smaller percentage of Jews who are reaffiliating after they have kids, but there is still a spike that happens there. But that we are still using outdated ideas of what proper Jewish behavior and proper Jewish engagement looks like. And so I started to argue back in 2013 that if we start to reframe our questions for what it looks like to be an engaged, identifying Jew in America, and if we ask questions that privilege this as a valid way of being Jewish, that we're going to get a much healthier, much rosier, much more positive, optimistic view of American Judaism, rather than continuing to think that it's dying, that we are seeing the end of American Jewish culture, that Jews are overly assimilated, that we have lost Jewish American life. We haven't lost Jewish American life. It just looks different than it did 100 years ago. But that's fine. 100 years ago, it looked different than it looked 200 years ago. One of the reasons why Judaism has persisted for over 3,000 years is its ability to change and its ability to adapt. And we are trying to freeze Judaism in amber in a way that does nobody any kind of positive service. So I kind of end with this. This is a thought piece that was published just a couple days after the 2013 Pew study came out and caused a flurry of think pieces. And so this was published as an opinion piece in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. Religion matters. Beware the American cultural Jew. When being culturally Jewish in America means little more than lox and bagels, and a vague duty to repair the world, Israel should also be worried. So now, cultural American Jews who have the audacity to like bagels and tikkun olam, which frankly is a core Jewish value. I don't know why a vague duty to repair the world is somehow bad. But not only are they responsible for the death of American Judaism, now they are also responsible for the destruction of Israel. So this is all what went into forming me as a scholar and putting me on the path that I ended up on, and why I have now published these 2 volumes on Jewish humor and continue to think about this as important. And as Joel said, now I'm working on a book on Jewish comic book characters, but all of these, I think these are vital, exciting places where younger Jews are expressing their Jewish identity, and that we just haven't done a good enough job of respecting that and acknowledging that and allowing that to be considered a legitimate way of being Jewish. So thank you. That is what I wanted to bring to you today.
Betty, thank you so much. Given us a lot to think about, and love to hear questions from the room and also from the Zoom. Not to sound too much like Dr. Seuss.
I was going to say, are there questions in the room? Are there questions on the Zoom?
Are there questions from a mouse? Are there questions from the house? I could go on like that all night. People are processing the data clearly.
Such heady stuff.
Yeah, Professor Newman, we'll start with you. I saw your hand first.
Thanks so much. I wonder if you could talk about any particular examples, maybe Seinfeld or other ones, Broad City, maybe, about whether you see them as addressing Jewish audiences or about like the sense of affiliation that audiences may have with those characters and with the stories they tell or with their style of comedy. I think of the idea of having a sense of humor as an attribute of a person, but then it sounds like part of what you're saying is that maybe there's a taste for certain kinds of media, or that the media seem to be addressing some audiences?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very a good and kind of multifaceted question. So I think the answer to most parts of that is yes. And so one thing that I've written about and that I kind of track, and part of why I structured that first book around generations, is because I think that has been an evolving trend. And you can even see examples just from like 2025 media, stuff that's come out within the last 6-8 months. So broadly speaking, and to try to not make this a whole nother 45-minute talk, I think that what you see is a historical legacy of Jewish content that throws in an occasional inside joke for the Jewishly literate viewer, but by and large is treating Jewish identity in a pretty superficial manner, which again statistically makes sense. I mean, Jews for the last few decades have been like 1.8% of the American population. So if you are trying to speak only to a Jewishly literate audience, you're just not going to have enough people to make whatever you're making a success. But I think that's actually changing. And I think that has been changing recently due to the boom in streaming services. I think we're seeing an increase in media that actually is speaking to a Jewishly literate audience and doesn't care as much if a non-Jewishly literate audience fully gets it or not. And one of the best examples of that, one of the things I've enjoyed most in the last couple of years on that front, is Long Story Short. If anybody has not seen that yet, you have homework now. You can binge through the whole thing in under 4 hours. It is an animated series on Netflix by the guy who made BoJack Horseman. But if you don't like BoJack Horseman, it's okay, because I don't like BoJack Horseman and I liked this. But it is the most Jewish piece of media I have seen in years. And it's funny, it's smart, it's sweet, it is all the things, but it is also written in such a way that there is a lot of it that a non-Jewishly literate audience viewer is just not going to get, and they're okay with that. Whereas something like Seinfeld, when they dealt with Jewish stuff, so like I write about the Bris episode of Seinfeld in my first book, that is written from a kind of fetishized outside view of Judaism. Like the Jewish ritual is in fact reduced to a farce in that, partly because that's a Larry Charles episode. Larry Charles was the third member of the Seinfeld creative team, along with Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld himself. Larry Charles is very hostile to religion across the board. He was a producer of Bill Maher's documentary Religulous. So anytime you get a Larry Charles episode, you're going to get a lot of kind of anti-religion stuff. And he just, like, the character of Kramer in that episode refers to circumcision as a barbaric ritual. And that's as close to dealing with ritual Judaism as Seinfeld really ever got. Other than that, you get like Jerry getting in trouble for making out at Schindler's List, right? So it's all stuff that's really written that, as long as you are at the very least a New Yorker, you'll get the jokes. And that's how a lot of the stuff was in the 90s, the early 2000s. But since the 2010s, I think we've started to see a lot more smart Jewish media out there, which doesn't mean that the other kind has gone away. Like, Nobody Wants This still exists. So there is still the stuff that is about Jews and is really very clearly not for Jews. But we're getting, I think, more media that is engaged in thinking about Judaism and Jewish stuff in ways that matter to Jews, which I know is only kind of like a side part of your question, but your question was very rich. So I'm happy to talk more about that later as well.
Maureen Luddy asks, have there been further studies about affiliation post October 7th and says, I feel there is a stronger affiliation. I don't know if you have any information about that.
I don't have specific data about that. Thanks, Maureen, for that question. I am anecdotally, I have the same sense that you have. Certainly in that first year or so. I know a lot of people talked about going to Jewish spaces in a way that they hadn't in years, or in some cases decades. You know, people would post things like, I voluntarily went to synagogue for the first time since my bar mitzvah, you know, back in 1984 or whatever. But if these studies take a long time, it's usually at least a year, if not 2 years, between starting to collect the data, getting the data processed, getting it all published. So that kind of post October 7th data, if anyone's collecting it, and there probably are people who are collecting it, but they would be doing that now, and it would probably be late this year or next year before we started to see any of it published. So I haven't seen any large scale studies, but I can certainly check with some of my sociologist friends to see if they've seen some of that data starting to come out. But anecdotally, yes, my sense is the same as yours.
I was not concerned, but the number of non-Jews who have been converting to Judaism seems to be a little on the uprise. I don't know if you talked about that before we got here or not.
No, I didn't. And you know, largely, I think that that's a great thing. You know, and this is part of what, you know, part of what drove the new book, Wit Happens, is really wanting to celebrate the diversity of Judaism in ways that often don't get talked about, especially when we're talking about Jewish culture, which just gets so dominated by American Jewish stuff, and American Jewish stuff is assumed to be Ashkenazi. So both in recognizing the global cultures of Jews, but also in recognizing the various cultures that Jews by choice are bringing into Judaism, I think we get really kind of new and exciting interpretations of Jewish ritual and new Jewish foods and Jewish music, and really great developments and adaptations of Judaism. So again, I don't have the data at my fingertips to say whether the number of Jews by choice is on the rise or not, but I kind of know the sense that you're referring to. And I think overall it's a really good thing. There was a kind of trashy article that came out just a couple of weeks ago that was like pitting Jewish women against each other in a way that I thought was yucky. But it was like, Jewish women, what do you think about all of these Asian women who are marrying Jewish men and converting to Judaism? And most of the Jewish women who responded to it were like, it's great. I'm super excited to like learn how to roll sushi with my sister-in-law and to teach her, how to make matzo balls. That this is all, it gives us a new thing to offer at the dairy breakfast. We can all have sushi rolls. So there has been this kind of discussion of that, but overall, I think that it really should be seen as a net positive. And if we want to freak out about Jews having a low birth rate, then conversion is a great antidote to that. Like, Jews don't want to have a lot of babies? That's great. Bring a friend.
Thank you. I have a question about the new book, Wit Happens. You mentioned some of the other countries that are covered. Does it get into Latin American stuff or European at all?
I mean, it does get into European. One of the saddest things to me about the book is that we did have somebody writing a chapter about Latin America, and they unfortunately had to withdraw at a point where the book was too far in the process to be able to replace them. It had, if you care about the ins and outs of academic publishing, it had already gone through peer review. So we weren't able to then pull in a new chapter. It would have slowed the production down by at least 2 years. And we thought it was important to get the book out. So that is the biggest gap in it, is that there isn't a Latin American chapter. There are folks who are doing that work that I'm happy to recommend to people. But unfortunately, that is the continent that is missing. is South America. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's volume 2, which still happens.
I'm wondering, what's the history of Jewish humor? Like when did it become a thing, right? That, that so many people are, talk about, and it's just common, and you don't see it in necessarily other ethnicities, right?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a great question. And that is one of the really difficult questions and there are tons and tons of, well, not tons, but there are at least 6 books on Jewish humor. And all of them are trying to wrestle with that question. One of the things that's really important to me as a humor scholar is that I feel strongly that comedy is extremely culturally and linguistically specific. It is nearly impossible to translate jokes and have them work because so much of comedy is just based in the rhythm of a language and just the way that a language sounds. And that is something that's so hard to translate. So I'm very suspicious. Some of the books try to trace the lineage of Jewish humor all the way back to the Bible and the Talmud. And to say, look, Sarah laughed when God told her that she was going to have a child at 90 years old, and Isaac means laughter. And look, the rabbis in the Talmud, it's this dialogical process and this back and forth, and that's why Jews are funny. And Freud wrote about it and said, well, Jews are funny because Jews have been persecuted. And that's maybe closer to working. But I try not to worry too much about figuring out the origin because I just think we don't know the answer to that. We can't tell for sure what was a joke 2,000 years ago. But what I will say is that, and again, this is part of what led to the new book, is that there's a very clear line from Sholem Aleichem and the Yiddish writers of the 19th century, bringing that over to the United States and Jews in America getting involved in early media, in vaudeville, starting in Yiddish theater, moving into vaudeville, then moving into early film, moving into television. So there is one clear trajectory that follows that arc. But what we were interested here was trying to figure out if that's the only trajectory. If you look at comedy being written by somebody who comes out of a North African context, whose parents never were Eastern European and who never has been American, does his humor look different? And part of the difficulty with it is that American Jewish style of humor has become so globally prevalent that even cultures that are not Jewish, are not American, they now stand-up looks the same all over the world. So it becomes really hard to tease that out. But what I will also say is that actually most religions have comedy kind of built into their ritual. It is a particularly American Protestant notion that comedy is somehow sacrilegious and that religious comedy is sacrilegious. And it's really a white American Protestant. There's a guy named Vaughn Booker who's writing a book about humor in the Black church and doing similar work and basically saying all of these things that we as Americans have this sense is oh, that's, it's outside the bounds for religion. Religion is serious and making fun of religion is therefore sacrilegious, that actually most cultures don't see it that way. And there are religious satiric ritual forms in cultures, religious cultures all over the world, that for various reasons, that's just not the way that American culture came to feel about religion. But Jews are more alike with other cultures outside of the US on that score than they are here. So it's a fascinating thing around the globe.
I've got a question. Okay. So I'm thinking about how humor, so often is about crossing boundaries and pushing limits. And, I was sitting here thinking about oh, what if there's somebody here from, a mainstream Jewish organization, what can they learn from this? And thinking about some of the edgy comedy, like Broad City was mentioned, and thinking about Jews on a Plane and the Shiva, right? It's just a boundary crossing. So well, I guess my first question is, like, is there something that you think would be, like, is there something for mainstream Jewish organizations to learn from this? But also when they try, does that just mean that then the boundary has to get pushed because then it becomes,
It's not cool anymore.
it's not cool anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And it's a question I've gotten in the past. And my usual answer is that if I had the answer to that, I would be making so much more money than I'm making as an academic. Like if I knew how to get people to show up to JCC events, I would be a consultant making zillions of dollars. You know, what I will say is part of the last thing you said, I think is a portion of it. And it's not just for Jewish organizations, right? Anything, as soon as the olds start trying to speak to the youths, we have murdered whatever it is, and then the youths are going to need to move to the next thing. So you know, you can't play catch up in that way. So what I think is important is just to keep an open mind about what we're counting as sites of Jewish engagement. So like maybe, you know, maybe young people aren't going to want to come to movie night at the JCC, even if you're showing Broad City, right? But, you know, and I was talking about this earlier, I just saw a high school production of Paula Vogel's Indecent, which is an incredibly difficult play about the production of this play by a man named Sholem Ash. He wrote this play that, you know, involved throwing a Torah scroll and lesbian kiss, and this was in the 1920s, 1930s, and they all got arrested for indecency. And this high school did this production, and so most of the cast wasn't Jewish, but there was one young woman who had been their kind of dialect coach, I guess, because she was the one Jewish kid in the cast. And so I had been asked to come do a talkback Q&A after this. And somebody asked a question to her and said, you know, so what was it like? And you know, so here you've got this like 16-year-old kid talking about all of the Googling she had to do to help people learn how to pronounce Yiddish and to like figure it out. And like, she spent 2 months immersing herself in Jewishness in a way that's never going to show up in survey data. And she did that because she felt ownership of this play and of this element of this play because she was Jewish and it was a play about Jews. So like, that's not that we're not asking those questions. And I don't know how to write those questions because again, I'm not a professional data scientist. If I were, once again, I would be making more money. But I think it's so important that we try. Like, I think that that's where younger people are feeling connected to their Jewishness. And as soon as they get to the point where they are feeling like that doesn't count, that's when they start to back off and disaffiliate and feel like they're bad Jews. And they're not like, oh, well, I don't want to go to the Jewish Film Festival down at the JCC, so I guess I'm not a good Jew, even though I just spent 2 months teaching my fellow high schoolers how to pronounce Yiddish correctly, right? So it's just, I think there's so much cultural interaction that's happening, and we've got to find a way to value that and to make young people who are engaging with culture and feel Jewish about it. We've got to find a way to validate that and to tell them that that is a good, valid way of being Jewish, and see where that goes. When we have a generation who are validated instead of told that they are bad cultural Jews who are going to somehow destroy the state of Israel, you know, what do they produce? What do they look like? What's it going to look like when they're 30? We don't know because we haven't tried.
Jenny, I'm so glad that Rachel asked that question, and I appreciate your response. And that kind of crystallizes a question that I already had for you about, I think it was the last slide, and those questions of, you know, remembering the Holocaust, being part of the Jewish community, Jewish humor, etc. Can you say a little bit more about the methodology there, to the extent that you know? And what I was struck by, kind of what you were just saying, the questions that, or the responses that aren't there. And I don't know if they aren't there because they weren't asked or because people aren't offering them. Can you say a bit about why we're seeing those particular categories?
My understanding is that they collected the data on this in a couple of phases and a couple of different ways. So they asked, I believe, if I understand correctly, they asked a sort of open-ended, what is an essential part of being Jewish, and then tried to see if those fit into large categories. And then as some of those large categories presented themselves, they started to structure the question a little bit differently, if I'm remembering correctly, to the 2013, that for 2020, they pretty much went in with 2013's categories. So you see that they were basically, there were some things that they added. So like continuing family traditions was new. But other than that, they largely imported 2013's categories. But for 2013, if I remember correctly, they started trying to make it open-ended. They were getting too many one-off responses to be able to actually have statistical significance to that. So then they drew out the things that seemed to be coming up most strongly. And then they said, so given this list, which of these do you think is an essential part of being Jewish? Which means that some, if not many, of the respondents probably selected more than one.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm struck by, I mean, one thing that just really kind of slapped me in the face, and there was, you know, a bit of baggage here as a Jewish studies professor, but even aside from taking Jewish studies classes, which of course everybody should do all the time, seriously, just Jewish learning,
Yeah.
you could say that it might come into some of those categories, like remembering the Holocaust,
Being
right? But
intellectually curious.
yeah, I guess that, like, that's just sort of vague, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, and some of that's going to be by nature of the fact that these are all going to be adults that they're surveying, and they're pretty exclusively going to be post-collegiate adults. Also, at least with 2013, I'm not sure if they'd switched things up by 2020, but in 2013, they were still exclusively using landlines. So that's going to be a bit of a self-selecting population anyway, because even by then, lots of people had ditched their landline phones. So you're going to have an older skewing audience, or response pool. I think they had started to vary that by 2020 because they realized their data was flawed in that way. But yeah, if they had included a question about Jewish learning and Jewish education and it just didn't even hit the kind of 14-15%, so they didn't include it, I don't know. But it is, I mean, I think that is a big kind of missing piece, because lots of organizations and institutions, like, it doesn't have to just be college classes, right? It's taking a class, you know, taking an adult ed at the shul, or going to a knitting class at the JCC, or, you know, like, learning can look, going to a warehouse kind of thing, learning can look a lot of different ways. And so I agree with you that that's kind of missing. But I don't know if it's missing because they didn't ask it, or if it's missing because they asked it and it just didn't get responses.
Well, and also this sort of goes directly back to Mike Newman's question at the beginning about engaging in terms of things like the content of comedy, but also other things. You haven't really, at least more than in passing, sort of talked about new media, Instagram. I mean, I'm thinking of my own, you know, late teens, early 20s sons who are engaging with that world a lot, and just generally, but including, let's say, Jewish comedians or who are commentators on Israel-Palestine or various other issues.
Yeah.
That's an important site for them and a lot of their peers. Can you say a little bit more about, how is that being studied and what kind of conclusions are being?
So I think that's hugely important. And I've started trying to get into that. So in a piece that I published a couple years ago, I talk about Miriam Anzovin, who started on TikTok and then kind of expanded onto other social media platforms, doing these daily Daf Yomi reaction videos. And she and I have talked about it. She said, you know, when she first started posting these videos, she thought maybe 10 people would see them. And now she has videos that have been seen in the millions. And these videos are just her responses to a daily Talmud study. Like, this is nothing that millions of people should find engaging enough to sit through a video on, but it's because she's funny, and it's because she has, you know, pop culture references. And I just saw there's a very recent, a woman who's recently gone viral, named Chef Tova. She's a social media influencer chef, and she just hit over 1 million followers. So she made a little celebration video just within the last couple of days to celebrate having over 1 million followers. And I guarantee you that that million followers may be mostly people under the age of 25, but it is not going to be entirely Jews. So, you know, and so I think that that's another thing that's kind of difficult to tease out a bit is, you know, when you're just looking at follower counts, there's no way to know, unless you go back to like, do they have a kind of Jewish sounding name? And so I'm sure that there are people at like Pew and some of these other think tanks that are figuring out how to get the big data on a lot of the social media trends. For my work, I have mostly done it by contacting the creators because I don't have the tools to really do a deep dive into the followers. But the creators sometimes do have a sense of who their followers are because they're interacting with them, they're getting DMs from them, things like that. So in talking to like people like Miriam Ansevin, I get a sense of who her subscribers are. But I don't have data tools for that.
Just a super quick comment that our colleague Simon Bronner shares.
Simon.
Shares that Pew has a 2025 survey of Israelis, including attitudes towards religion, as an FYI.
Yes, Pew has everything. Pew is great.
I'm not sure how to ask this question or if it'll make sense, but someone asked about the trajectory of Jewish humor, and I'm wondering about the role of the perception of anti-Semitism, because it seems to me the people you're describing and what we're seeing, it flies in the face of the notion of the rise of anti-Semitism. That my generation, which is the baby boomers, were afraid to be Jewish and funny, or funny and Jewish, I guess. And that shift is profound and it's in our faces. And I just wonder if you've done any examining of that or.
Yeah, I have a little bit. I mean, that works its way into a lot of my writing. So as luminary a figure as Mel Brooks was once asked, you know, what he thought of the idea of Jewish comedy. And he basically shut it down. He said, I'm not a Jewish comedian. I don't do Jewish comedy. He says, Jewish comedy is in Poland. It's in Vilna. I do maybe New York comedy. I do American comedy, but it's not Jewish comedy. So like I think that's very indicative of that older generation that didn't want to be identified that way, that thought that was overexposure. We talked about this a lot this afternoon in the workshop about comic books, this fear of overexposure and that was going to cause bounce back anti-Semitism if it was too in your face that, you know, these people were Jews. And so that's how you get Norman Lear making All in the Family, like one of the most un-Jewish characters ever to exist on TV in Archie Bunker. And yet Rob Reiner still ends up, you know, as a son. So like you can't get away from it. I identify, and this is probably just personal bias, but I identify Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song as a generational turning point for that. That was like a latter-day Lenny Bruce's Jewish and Goyish routine. And it just told Jewish kids of a certain age, and I happen to have been the right age for that like being Jewish was fun and cool, and it didn't have, like, there's no content to that song. Like, it's literally just a list of names. There's no actual content. There's no lyrical content. It's just, I have made these names rhyme. Billy Joel did it with We Didn't Start the Fire. Adam Sandler did it with a Hanukkah song. Like, just rhyme some names. But therefore, it told a generation of Jewish kids that, like, just existing as a Jew in the world is okay, and it's fun, and it's cool. And you can spin the dreidel with Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, both Jewish. And I think that really, that we saw then a whole new generation of Jewish comedy and media in general, that these are Jewish characters. This is a lot of what I think you see on Broad City, a lot of these where these are just Jewish characters who occasionally might do something that engages with Jewishness, but otherwise, or like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, like in the very first episode of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, she describes herself as Jewish. She mentions being Jewish, but it's not like it's not a plot point necessarily, because being Jewish is just becomes a thing that about which young Jews can be out front upfront about and think is fun, but not necessarily need to therefore do a Briss episode like Seinfeld felt the need to do a Briss episode. And I think that that's good. I don't think it necessarily says that the rise in anti-Semitism isn't happening, but I think it at least says that younger content creators and younger artists don't see the answer to rising anti-Semitism as hiding, sublimating their identity. I don't think they know what the answer is. I don't think any of us know what the answer is, but they don't seem to think that it's putting that under a, keeping the lid on that, the way that in the 1950s and 1960s that became the, tamp it down.
Thank you. For the very last question.
All right. Simon says, my question is about the commentary you showed about calling out American Jews. Isn't that an example of projection? Since surveys show that Israeli Jews are increasingly secular and cultural, and despite stereotypes that Israelis don't have a sense of humor, many Israeli scholars are following humor, especially on social media.
Yeah. So hi again, Simon. So to the last part first, we have 2 chapters in the Wit Happens book about Israeli comedy. There is lots of Israeli comedy. What's interesting in that is that tons of the scholarship about American Jewish comedy says like, oh, well, Jewish comedy is about having a certain kind of outsider position that allows you to satirize the larger culture. And like from the Marx Brothers on, it's all about, being sort of outside the mainstream. And that's what makes Jewish comedy, Jewish comedy. And that argument does not work in Israel. So there's a whole different body of scholarship on Israeli comedy, and people like my colleagues in the book, like Avinoam Pat at NYU and Liat Stier-Livni, who's in Israel, they are doing that kind of really smart, good work on Israeli comedy. Do I think that this is projection? I mean, yeah, like I feel sometimes like I owe Leon Morris an apology email because I've used his badly constructed anti-cultural Jew bashing article from 12, 13 years ago now. Like I have built an entire career out of saying, I disagree with this man. And so like at some point I should find him and I should apologize. But yeah, I mean, it is absolutely projecting, but it's projecting a sense that people have had for 30 plus years at this point, ever since this term cultural Jew caught on, which really you start to see it catching on in the 1980s. And just to go back to the gender piece of it, I believe, and from what I've studied, it looks like it started to catch on in part after the Reform movement's ruling in favor of accepting patrilineal descent Jewish children. Because if you remember the data, Jewish women were seen as being better at transmitting Jewish identity than Jewish fathers. So now you suddenly had a whole generation of patrilineal descended Jewish kids who are being raised by the wrong Jewish parent because fathers were not seen as raising good Jews. And so clearly those kids who in 1983 suddenly became Jewish that hadn't been considered Jewish before, they're clearly going to be the wrong kind of Jews because they have the wrong Jewish parent. So I think a lot of this spirals out of the Reform movement. And, to this day, the conservative movement and the Orthodox movements still do not accept patrilineal descended Jews as halakhically Jewish. They need to convert if they want to be considered Jewish in those contexts. So I look at that as really the starting point for this demonization of cultural Jews, is because you've now got all this huge wave of children of Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers who are assumed to therefore not be getting the right kind of Jewish education at home, and it kind of spins out from that. So, yeah. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you all online and in the room for great questions and observations. Thank you so much to Professor Jenny Caplan for sharing all that data and all of your wisdom with us. Those of you in the room, please stay for refreshments and you can ask more questions. And if you need a card, Christine has them, I have them, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.
I wasn't gonna let people go until we, Mel Brooks's name come up. So now I
Right.
can, I
Yeah,
can do that.
exactly.
God of the master.
Yeah, I keep